Hi, I'm the History Guy. I have a degree in history. I love history. If you love history too, this is the channel for you. In the early part of the 19th century, there was a set of conflicts, conquests, mass migration, and dislocation across southern and central Africa that was collectively known as the Imfakane, or the smothering. And there were a lot of causes of the Imfakana: a population explosion, a drought, contacts with European culture, but central to it all was the rise of a powerful, expansionistic, militaristic kingdom under the leadership of a charismatic king who was one of the most gifted military strategists in the history of the earth. And if you want to understand the rise of Shaka Zulu and the Zulu kingdom, the place to start is the 1818 Battle of Gokli Hill. The Zulu Civil War started before the Battle of Gokli Hill, but the battle represented a turning point in the very nature of the conflict, and well demonstrated the skill of the personality that drove the rise of the Zulu, the key dynamic in the Imfakane. In 1818, the Zulu, under their 29-year-old king Shaka, were a minor tribe, vassals of a larger kingdom that was in the process of decline in the face of a rival, the powerful Netawandi kingdom. At Gokli Hill, Shaka used a number of strategies that would be recognizable on the battlefield today: deception, guerrilla warfare, decoy. But to understand the nature of the battle, first we have to understand the nature of the way that Shaka transformed the very way that the Zulu fought wars. Traditional warfare among the Zulus had been done with relatively light throwing spears. The two armies would stand at a respectful distance, they would shout insults back and forth, and they would throw their spears until one side or the other decided that they had lost. It was almost more ceremony than warfare, and the casualties were relatively light. But Shaka decided that this was pointless, that it made more sense to fight in close combat where you knew you had killed your enemy. And so he changed the weapon from a long light spear to a short, long-bladed stabbing spear that worked more like a sword. It was called an ikthwa, and to give you an idea how brutal this kind of combat was, that name, ikthwa, represented the sound it made when you withdrew it from a person after stabbing them. Shaka also changed the size of the traditional lozenge-shaped cowhide shield that a Zulu warrior carried, making it much larger. That gave more protection against the throwing spears, but it made it heavy enough to use as a battering weapon. As opposed to standing at a distance and throwing spears at each other, the way that Shaka saw a fight was that you would charge your enemy with your heavy shield, hit them hard to knock them off balance, hook their shield with yours to pull it back and create an opportunity to stab them with your ikthwa. It was a brutal and effective change to the way that the Zulus engaged in warfare. Moreover, Shaka expected his warriors to have a greater level of training and discipline than ever before expected of the Zulu, with hours of training turning them into peak physical specimens. And then he formed them into distinct military units called impis that were much closer to the lines of European armies. It was in the context of this change in warfare that the king of the Netawande sent his oldest son, Nomalinjana, with 12,000 warriors to attack Shaka and his mere 5,000 warriors in April of 1818. The Netawande were expecting to annex the Zulu lands, and they expected that it would be an easy fight. The first tactic that Shaka used was to use guerrilla tactics. He would use small forces to contest river crossings and thus slow the advance of the Netawande. This is a tactic that would be well understood on a 20th century battlefield. Shaka used that time to move his people out of harm's way to the fringe of Zululand, and then to strip all the land that the Netawanda had across of all useful supply, so that they had exhausted their supply before they even got to the battle. When it came time to fight, Shaka chose his ground carefully. He placed his army on top of a hill, Gokli Hill, but the hill had a large depression on top, and that way Shaka could hide his numbers and his preparation from the enemy. Then Shaka employed a diversion. He sent a small bit of his army, leading a bunch of cattle, off in the distance where the Netawande army could see them. Nomalinjana took the bait. He thought that that was Shaka moving all of his cattle, which represent wealth in Zulu culture, and he realized he had a chance to catch them. He sent nearly 4,000 men of his force chasing after Shaka's diversion. Shaka had a great defensive position on the hill, but he had to goad Napoleon into attacking him on the hill. And so he hid most of his troops in the depression to make it look like he was smaller and weaker than it really was. Napoleon took the bait. He thought that this would be simple. He said to one of his generals, "This will be like slaughtering cattle." But as the Netawande moved up the hill, they realized that it was difficult to bring their numbers to bear, because as they climbed the hill, the units started crushing together. And then, when they were pressed together so that they couldn't maneuver, Shaka sprung a trap. His warriors used the impetus of the hill to charge down and use their brutal close combat tactics. The Netawande army was thrown back. Napoleon wasn't stupid. He knew what was going on, but he just didn't have an answer. He tried several different modes of attack, but all of them were thrown back because the Zulus had the advantage of the hill and the powerful close combat tactics. Moreover, the Netawande army was tiring. They were climbing up and down the hill, and they'd run out of the water that they carried with them. And they were starting to straggle back towards the closest river, which was nearly 2 miles away. Unknown to Napoleon, Shaka had prepared for this. Up in the depression on the hill, he had water and food for his troops, so that his troops were refreshed while the Netawande army was exhausting. What Shaka lacked was time. He knew eventually the 4,000 warriors had gone chasing after the cattle would return. He had to goad Napoleon into one more attack so that he could defeat the main army before the other force came back. And so what he did was rearrange his warriors so that it looked like the units were more depleted than they were. Napoleon at the bottom of the hill saw these depleted units and assumed that they were as exhausted as the Netawande were, that they'd been fighting on a hill all day with no water. And he took the bait. He assumed that one last mass attack would overrun the Zulus for good. And so he personally led 1,200 warriors up the hill one last time. But Shaka had a last trick up his sleeve. All day he had been hiding a significant reserve of warriors that Napoleon didn't even know about. As his troops moved up the hill, Shaka threw in his reserves. They charged around and flanked Napoleon's army, capturing that entire force, encircling them, and killing them all. Napoleon and 4 of his brothers died in the fight. Then it was an easy mop-up to chase down the rest of the army, which broke and ran. In the end, the Netawande army lost 7,500 of its warriors and 5 of the king's sons. The Battle of Gokli Hill wasn't the beginning of the Zulu Civil War or the Imfakane, and it wasn't the end of the Netawande. They were still a much larger force than the Zulus. And the Zulus had taken significant losses. Shaka lost nearly 2,000 of his entire 5,000-person force, and many cattle. But the failure to defeat Shaka in 1818, when he was at his weakest, would have long-term ramifications. When the two armies met again a year later, Shaka had absorbed many smaller kingdoms and was far more powerful than had been before. And, one more time, he used brilliant tactics to defeat a much larger force and eventually defeat the Netawande. The Battle of Gokli Hill is what set Shaka Zulu down the path of creating the great Zulu kingdom. The ripple effects of the Zulu conquest were massive. Displaced people like the Netawande now had Zulu weapons and tactics, and they would move along, conquering and subjugating other people as ripple effects went all the way through southern and central Africa. In the end, the effects of the great migrations of the Imfakane would cost the native population of South Africa as many as 2 million lives. That depopulation would then facilitate the expansion of European settlements in South Africa, though it would also create the great native nations that became the greatest obstacles to those European settlements, and it would set up a series of colonial conflicts that would continue throughout the 19th century and still impact borders, politics, and conflicts today. Rarely has one personality so greatly affected an entire region, really half a continent. Shaka Zulu is as important to the history of Africa as Napoleon was to the history of Europe. And that rise all started with the Battle of Gokli Hill. I'm the History Guy. I hope you enjoyed this edition of my channel. 5 minutes of history, short snippets of forgotten history between 5 and 10 minutes long. If you enjoyed this, then hit the like button on the left. If you have any questions or comments, write them in the comment section. And if you want 5 more minutes of history, all you need to do is click the button on the right to subscribe.